wasn't your fault. You can't control everything.
You've given me a reason to protect, Clara.
No one wanted to marry the orphan girl until a poor rancher gave her his name, his home, and his fight. The wind in Redemption Creek, Texas, in 1878, never stopped blowing. It was a persistent, dry whisper that carried the dust of the plains and the sharp scent of a town that had long lost hope. The wind was like cold, bony fingers, scratching at the skin, caressing faces, as if to remind everyone that everything here was harsh and hopeless. For Clara Belle, the wind wasn't just a sound, it was a verdict. It was the town's laughter, the gossip of women in the general store, the scrutinizing eyes of Thaddeus Granger, who was chasing her down. Clara ran, not because she wanted to live, but out of pure instinct. Her bare feet were cold and bleeding, stepping on pebbles and sharp thorns, but she no longer felt the pain. Fear had become a thick blanket, covering all other sensations. Last night, it had happened too fast. Clara, just an orphan girl working as a seamstress, had accidentally witnessed Thaddeus Granger forcing a frail old farmer to sign papers selling his land. The old man's trembling hands, his wrinkled face full of despair, and the disgusting smile on Thaddeus's lips had been etched into Clara's mind. She couldn't ignore it, so she had thrown a stone to create a distraction and run away, a rash and foolish act. Now she was a witness, a thorn that needed to be removed. The sound of Thaddeus's horse's hooves echoed in the air, getting closer, clearer, like a death knell. Each beat of her heart rang in her ears, fast and urgent like a gunshot. She darted onto the main street, hoping someone would help her, but everyone turned their faces away. Some rushed to close their windows, others looked down. No one dared to help her. They were afraid of Thaddeus. Besides, to them, she was just a rootless orphan, a troublemaker. Thaddeus Granger, with a sinister smile on his lips, spoke up. "You little rat. I told you to get out of my town, didn't I?" His words were like a hammer blow to Clara's already shattered self-respect, awakening painful memories of her past. All her life, people had called her names like that. Useless thing, troublemaker, or little rat. She was used to being abandoned, to being looked down on. She was used to the solitude of her life, a life of constant running and searching for a safe haven, a life that even a normal person wouldn't want. Now, the sound of the horse hooves, and Thaddeus's words weren't just chasing her, they were chasing her entire painful past. In her most desperate moment, as her breath grew thin and her legs were about to give out, she collided with a man. His wagon was loaded with logs, and the strong scent of dry cedar wood filled the air. He was Silas Boone. Silas was a man with rough, calloused hands so thick with scars they looked carved from old oak. His eyes were hidden deep beneath the brim of his wide hat, revealing only a tired gaze that seemed to have seen too much pain and loss. He didn't say a word, just quietly loaded the logs onto his wagon. Thaddeus's horse hooves thundered down the street. He stopped right next to them, looking at Clara Belle with contempt. "You piece of trash," he growled. "I told you to get out of my town." He turned to Silas. "Old man, this girl's a thief. She stole my money, so you'd best not get mixed up with her." Silas remained silent. He didn't look at Thaddeus, nor at Clara. He just stood there, like an old tree weathering a storm. Clara heard her heart pounding, a desperate beat. She knew he would hand her over to Thaddeus. She was used to being abandoned. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of pushing her away, Silas slowly, deliberately, held out his calloused hand. It wasn't demanding or forceful. It was simply a silent offer. It had been a long time since Clara Belle had felt such warmth and protection from a man. She was scared, but there was no judgment in his eyes. There was a weariness, a deep sadness, but no disgust or lust. His hand felt rough like wood, but was full of certainty. Clara hesitated, looking into his eyes. She saw the emptiness in them, a wordless pain. Finally, she reached out her own hand, the thin, cold hand of a person who had nothing left to lose. When their hands touched, a warmth spread through Clara's body. She no longer felt the cold of the wind. She no longer heard Thaddeus's mocking laughter. She only heard her heart beating, a stronger, more vital beat. Silas pulled her up onto the wagon. The wagon began to roll, leaving the hateful and cold town behind. The wind still blew, but now its sound was like a sad melody, a song of parting. Clara Belle looked back at the town where she had once dreamed of a peaceful life, but everything had shattered. The whole way, they didn't say a word. There was only the clatter of the wheels on the trail, the wind, and the silence. Clara sat quietly next to him, occasionally glancing at his rugged face. She could feel the warmth from his body, a warmth that helped her get through the cold of the descending night. The whole way, they didn't say a word. There was only the clatter of the wheels on the trail, the wind, and the silence. Clara sat quietly next to him, occasionally glancing at his rugged face. She could feel the warmth from his body, a warmth that helped her get through the cold of the descending night. When they arrived at Silas's farm, it was dark. It was an old, lonely log cabin in the middle of a vast field, with no neighbors. The smell of damp earth and pine wood filled her nostrils, a simple scent that brought a feeling of safety. Silas didn't say anything, just got out of the wagon, lit a lamp, and led her inside. The fire blazed in the fireplace, chasing away the cold but not her fear. He gave her an old blanket and pointed to a corner of the house. "I'll go," Clara whispered. "I won't cause you any trouble." Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at her with tired eyes. Then he pointed at the blanket, then at the door outside, and finally at her. The meaning was very clear. The blanket was hers, and she could sleep there. She could also leave whenever she wanted. The decision was up to her. Clara Belle curled up under the old blanket, the firelight dancing on his quiet face. She didn't know if she had made the biggest mistake of her life, or if she had been saved. But for the first time in weeks, she fell into a deep sleep without dreaming of being abandoned. It was a sleep not haunted by the sound of the wind or malicious words. The smell of wood smoke and coffee was the first thing Clara noticed when she woke up, a gentle awakening that was both foreign and safe. She lay still, listening to the steady thud of an axe from outside. Each strike of the axe created a warm, solid sound, like the beat of a vibrant heart. That sound was a complete opposite to the violent, frantic pounding of horse hooves she had heard last night. It evoked a sense of peace, a stability she had forgotten for a very long time. Clara Belle slowly sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. The gnawing hunger in her stomach reminded her that it had been many days since she'd had a decent meal. She looked around the small cabin. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating the simple furnishings. An old wood stove, a small wooden table, a few chairs, and a thick ledger placed neatly on a shelf. Everything was strangely clean and tidy, as if arranged by a man too familiar with solitude, too used to taking care of himself. She stepped out of the cabin, taking a deep breath. The air was cold and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine wood. Silas was nearby, holding an axe, his muscles rippling under his faded shirt. He didn't look at her, just continued his work methodically. The axe strokes were not actions of anger, but of calmness and discipline. Clara watched him silently, like a small animal hiding and exploring a new world. When he stopped and looked up, their eyes met. There was no awkwardness, no judgment. He just gave a nod, then gestured toward the cabin, where she could smell the fragrant coffee and a bit of toasted bread. It wasn't an invitation, but a permission. They ate breakfast in silence. Clara Belle sat across from Silas, carefully nibbling on each piece of bread and sipping her coffee. She felt ashamed of her appetite, but Silas didn't watch her. He just focused on his own meal, and occasionally she could see his eyes glance at her thin hands, then look away. She felt cared for, but not scrutinized. After the meal, Clara got up and started to tidy up. She didn't ask for his opinion, she just did it, as a way to prove her worth, that she wasn't a burden. She carefully washed the dishes and placed them on the wooden rack. He still stood there, watching her silently, and in a rare moment, the weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a subtle observation, as if he were trying to understand something. In the afternoon, they worked together. Silas showed Clara how to stack logs on the wagon, and she quietly followed. He worked quickly and powerfully, and she tried her best to keep up. Her hands began to ache, and blisters reappeared, but she didn't give up. She felt like she was living, doing something meaningful. She felt the warmth from his hand when they accidentally touched, and that feeling spread throughout her body. When dusk fell, Silas gave Clara an old pair of boots that had been carefully patched. They didn't fit perfectly, but they were much warmer than her bare feet. It wasn't a gift, but a necessity, a practical gesture full of meaning. That night, Clara lay on her blanket, watching Silas spread his blanket on the floor. She felt her heart tighten. She'd had a peaceful day, but she knew she couldn't stay here forever. She needed to leave before he grew tired of her, before she was abandoned again. "Do you want me to leave tomorrow?" Clara whispered. Her voice was so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. Silas didn't answer. He just looked at her with his silent gaze, then slowly stood up. Clara Belle held her breath, thinking he was going to tell her to go. But then, he just quietly picked up his blanket and spread it out in a different corner, a little closer to the fireplace. A simple action, but one with profound weight. It wasn't a promise, but an acceptance. It wasn't go away, but stay. Clara looked at him, and tears began to fall. She wasn't crying from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. She whispered, "I want to stay." Silas nodded, a gentle nod. It was the yes she had been longing for. The third morning, the cold was bone-chilling, like a sharp needle. It not only pierced the wooden walls, but also seeped into every fiber of her flesh, through every crack in the window frame. It was the cold of the Wild West, a cold that could freeze both faith and hope. But for Clara Belle, the cold was no longer the enemy. Lying under the thick blanket, she felt warm, a feeling she never thought she would have. She felt a warmth that came not just from the fire in the stove, but also from an inner peace, a sense of safety she had been searching for her entire life. The sound of Silas's axe chopping wood from outside was still steady, still solid, but now it was a part of a routine, a part of the peace. The sound of the axe was no longer the sound of loneliness, but the rhythm of a new life, a symphony of labor and protection. It was a sound that soothed the terrifying memories of chasing hooves and the town's mockery. Clara Belle lay there, breathing deeply the cold but vibrant air, feeling every bit of warmth seep in, and knew that, at last, she had found her home. Today, Clara woke up earlier. She tiptoed to the kitchen, started the fire, and prepared breakfast. All her life, she had never taken care of anyone, never been given the chance to cook a meal out of love, not out of duty. She smelled the fragrant roasted coffee, the scent of corn cakes baking on the hot coals. These actions weren't subservient, but an act of gratitude and connection. She no longer felt like a guest, but a part of this home. When Silas walked in, he saw Clara placing plates on the table. A moment of silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full of meaning. He placed the axe in the corner, took a deep breath, and quietly sat down across from her. This morning's breakfast was no longer just a meal to survive. Clara Belle began to tell her story, not with a lament, but in a dry, detached tone, as if she were narrating an event from a very long time ago. She didn't look into Silas's eyes, but at the patterns on the wooden tabletop, as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. Her voice grew softer, like the wind whistling through a crack in the door, full of emptiness and solitude. She told him about her years as an orphan, about being pushed from one home to another, each home a false promise of stability. Each time she mentioned a name, a place, she clenched her hands on her lap, her knuckles turning white. "They always said I was a burden," she whispered, "a useless thing that only knew how to eat and nothing else." That phrase wasn't just a sentence. It had become an invisible scar, etched deep in her soul, creating an obsession with her own worthlessness, that her existence was just a nuisance. That pain wasn't a sudden anger, but a numbness. She was used to being seen as an object, a shadow, and trying to prove her existence had become a survival instinct. Silas didn't say a word. He just listened quietly. His eyes held no pity but a deep understanding, as if he had walked a similar path. That gaze was the fire that warmed her soul, the only thing that allowed her to keep talking. She told him about being forced to work for free, about beatings, about nights spent curled up in the corner of a church, the fear she felt whenever someone touched her. The pain wasn't in the bruises, but in the coldness of people. It was the pain of a soul left behind, stripped of the right to be loved and cherished. It was the deepest pain a person could feel. Then it was Silas's turn. He rolled up his sleeve, a slow action, as if it took all his courage. A large, gnarled scar appeared on his shoulder, a deep mark on his tanned skin. It wasn't just a physical wound. It was a living memory, a silent accusation. He lightly touched it, as if touching a ghost. His voice was low, filled with pain and torment, a sound that had been buried for too long in the silence of the Wild West. "It was my fault," he whispered. "It should have been me who died, not my brother, Paul." Those words were not a fact, but a belief that had been ingrained in his bones. He told her about that fateful morning when they were herding cattle, a panicked bull, a horrifying stampede. He had tried to save Paul, but he couldn't. He held his brother's motionless body, feeling the life drain away, and from then on, this scar had become a constant reminder of his helplessness, of the guilt he had assigned to himself. The scar wasn't just where the wound had healed, but where everything he had ever hoped and dreamed of was buried. It was a symbol of the solitude he had chosen, a punishment he had imposed on himself. Clara quietly watched the tears roll down his cheek, hot tears on his rugged face. She didn't say anything. She just reached out her hand, gently, as if touching a piece of shattered glass. Her hand, which had once trembled with fear, was now steady and warm. She placed her hand on his scar. A strange feeling, both painful and soothing, spread through his body. He flinched a little, as if no one had ever touched that scar with such tenderness before. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "You can't control everything." Those simple words carried more weight than any other comfort. She continued, "It was an accident. Paul would have wanted you to live, to be happy. Living in torment is a disservice to your brother." Clara understood that Silas's pain wasn't a mistake, but self-torment, a form of self-punishment. And she, having lived with the torment of being abandoned, understood that feeling better than anyone. She didn't just touch his physical scar, she touched the deep wound in his soul. That action, those words, broke down the defensive wall he had built over many years. It was a silent promise. She was here, and she accepted him, with all his scars and all his pain. They had found a bridge in each other's pain. They were no longer two strangers, but two wounded souls who had found comfort. A new beginning. The next morning, the wind had stopped, leaving a deep silence as if the whole world was holding its breath. It was a silence Clara and Silas weren't used to, a stillness that came from every word and every secret being laid bare. From the moment Thaddeus left and Clara's name was written in the ledger, everything had changed. The fire in the stove, once just for warmth, now seemed to burn to illuminate a new future. They were no longer just two lonely people living together. They had become one. Clara Bell looked at Silas with different eyes, eyes that no longer held a constant fear or hesitation. Now, in her eyes, he was no longer a quiet, reclusive man, but a courageous one, a solid rock, ready to protect her from the town's storms. She had become so accustomed to abandonment that the pain had become a part of her. Thaddeus's vicious words, the townsfolk's cold stares, they were all knives cutting deep into her old wounds. But Silas's actions were more than just talk. They were an affirmation, a silent but powerful declaration. When he stood in front of Thaddeus and said, "She ain't nobody's property," he wasn't just protecting Clara from an evil man. He was protecting her from her own fear. His protection healed her emotional wounds, little by little, like the warm sunlight melting the icy surface of a river. From that day on, Clara no longer felt afraid. She no longer shrank back when someone looked at her, no longer looked down when she walked through a crowd. She had found someone she could trust, someone who not only sheltered her, but saw her true worth. Their love didn't need grand vows. It was expressed through small actions, subtle gestures, and meaningful silences. Like two broken pieces of a mirror, they had found each other and together created a perfect picture, where every crack was healed and every scar became a beautiful story. A walk through town. In the old days, going into town with Clara Belle was torture. Every street, every gaze, felt like a sharp blade cutting into her shredded self-respect. She would walk with her head down, avoiding the crowd, like a small mouse trying to hide. She hated the smell of road dust and the noise of the town because it was all tied to judgment and rejection. But today, everything was different. Clara no longer walked alone. She walked beside Silas, her head held high. She felt people's stares, but they weren't looks of mockery anymore. They were looks of curiosity and surprise. Silas said nothing, just held her hand in a firm, powerful grip. That grip wasn't just protection, it was a silent declaration. She's mine. She's not alone anymore. They walked through the familiar streets, but this time, Clara saw them differently. She saw people working, children playing, women talking on their porches. They were all images of life. A life she once thought she could never have. A sense of peace settled over Clara, a feeling so profound it made her feel weightless. A bright smile broke across her face, one she hadn't realized she was holding back. The sunlight felt warmer on her shoulders. She imagined people wanted to smile at her, to embrace her. The wildflowers along the road seemed more vibrant, their colors singing a silent song. The people on the street, who once seemed so cold and distant, now appeared kinder, their faces softened by a shared humanity she was finally allowed to be a part of. She was no longer a shadow in her own life, but a woman standing in the light. When they got to Ma Perkins's general store, something unexpected happened. Ma Perkins, the woman who once looked at Clara with cold, suspicious eyes, now looked at her with a warm smile. She handed Clara a bag of flower seeds and said, "Plant these in the spring, girl." Clara took the seeds, feeling the warmth from Ma Perkins's hand. She was speechless, just nodding and giving a bright smile. The seeds were not just a gift, but a form of acceptance, a welcome into the community. They were a symbol of hope, of a new future where she could sow seeds of love and life. After leaving the store, Clara and Silas walked to the riverbank. They sat on a large rock, watching the river flow. She felt a peace in her soul, a peace she had never had before. She rested her head on Silas's shoulder, and he gently placed his hand on her back. They didn't say anything, just quietly enjoyed the moment. It was a moment of healing, of mending old wounds. In that moment, Clara realized she had found something more precious than love: acceptance. She was no longer an outcast, a discarded thing. She was Clara Belle, a woman who was loved and cherished, and she knew that with Silas by her side, she could overcome any difficulty, any storm. They would build a new life together, a life they deserved. Promise. Sheriff Zeke Jones came to talk to Silas privately. He clapped him on the shoulder and said quietly, "Thaddeus is furious. You and Clara need to be careful." He then looked at Clara, his eyes full of respect. "But I'm impressed with you, Silas. You did what many in this town were too afraid to do." On the way back to the farm, Clara expressed her gratitude. She told him that she had been so used to being shunned, but he had treated her like a human being, like a life partner. She had found a sense of peace and safety in him that she had been searching for her entire life. Silas, in a rare moment, said, "You gave me a reason to protect Clara." That sentence, though short, held a deep meaning. It was an admission that she was not just someone he sheltered, but also his motivation, the light in his dark life. That night, they sat by the fire. The crackling wood seemed to tell old stories, and the flames danced on their faces, creating a cozy and intimate space. Clara began to talk about her dream, not a distant one, but a simple, real dream of a small garden. Her voice was soft, full of hope. She talked about the wildflowers she wanted to plant, the vegetable rows she would tend, and the feeling of her hands touching the damp soil. To her, that garden wasn't just a place to make a living, but a place to sow the seeds of hope, of life, a place she could call home. Silas listened quietly. He looked into the flickering flames as if he could see Clara's garden there. He was a man of practicality, of silence, But her dream had touched a deep place in his heart. It wasn't just a garden, it was a promise of a bright future, a future without loneliness. He looked into her eyes, which now held no fear, but anticipation and hope. He slowly took off the old silver ring on his hand. It was an intricately carved ring, a memento of his deceased mother, a symbol of love and family. He placed the ring in her palm. It was heavy and cold, but she felt its warmth. It wasn't just a gift, but a promise, a commitment to a shared future. "You stitched my heart back together," he said, his voice low with emotion. Clara looked at the ring in her palm, tears rolling down her cheeks. The old silver ring, worn by time, sparkled in the firelight, telling a story of those who had once worn it. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, but a keepsake, a symbol of the love and life Silas had once believed in and cherished. It represented all that he had lost and all that he longed to have. Clara no longer felt the cold of the metal, but only the warmth of the ring. She clutched it in her palm, as if clutching a promise, a belief. Her tears weren't a sign of weakness, but of release. She had been used to being abandoned, to being seen as a burden. But Silas had done what no one had ever done. He had placed in her hands a part of his memory, a part of his past, and a promise for the future. She understood that this was not just a ring, but a commitment. It was his way of saying that he accepted her, with all her wounds, her pain, and her secrets. It was a promise that she would never have to be alone again, never have to be afraid again. Their love didn't need grand vows or flowery words. Their love was expressed through small actions, subtle gestures, and meaningful gifts. The ring was a symbol of mending, of healing. It was proof that a broken heart could be stitched back together, that a lonely soul could find a home. It was a new beginning, a beginning she had never dared to dream of. A year later. A year has passed. The barren land of Redemption Creek is now covered in lush green grass. The silence in Silas Boone's cabin is no longer empty. It has been filled with the sounds of life. The wind still blows, but it is no longer an enemy, but an old friend telling fairy tales. The wind whistles through the wildflowers, carrying the scent of wild grasses and damp earth, and Clara Bell, now Silas's wife, can feel all of it. The years have shaped and changed them. Clara is no longer a skinny, scared orphan girl. She has a strong vitality, an inner peace. She has become a confident woman, with eyes sparkling with happiness. She caresses her growing pregnant belly, a symbol of hope and life. The scar on Silas's shoulder has also faded, no longer a reminder of guilt, but a mark of a healed past. Ma Perkins and Sheriff Zeke Jones came to visit. They brought no scrutinizing eyes or gossip. Instead, they carried a basket full of food and offered sincere, warm blessings. This scene, just a year ago, would have been unthinkable. Redemption Creek, with its cynical name, had never been a generous place, and acceptance here was a rare luxury. But then, these two people, an abandoned woman and a solitary man, created a miracle. Ma Perkins, the woman with the tough exterior of a general store owner, looked at Clara with admiration. Her eyes, which had once reflected the suspicion and prejudice of the entire town, now sparkled with respect. She placed the basket of food on the table, and for a rare moment, no words were spoken. The four of them, Clara, Silas, Ma, and Zeke, just looked at each other in silence, as if enjoying a wordless symphony of change. When the silence was enough, Ma Perkins finally spoke. Her voice was no longer harsh, but warm and thoughtful. "I was wrong about you," she said to Clara. "We, everyone in this town, were wrong. We looked at you with Thaddeus's eyes, with the eyes of rumors. We saw an orphan girl, an outcast, a problem to be solved. But Silas saw you, a human being. And that was the difference." Clara felt her eyes well up. She wasn't crying from sadness, but from relief, because a long-standing ache in her heart was finally being soothed. This was not just an apology, it was acceptance. Ma Perkins continued, her gaze directed at Clara's small garden, where wildflowers were blooming and vegetable rows were lush and green. "You are living proof," Clara. Proof that even a harsh town like Redemption Creek can change. Those words echoed in the space, melting the last layer of ice in Clara's heart. She understood that the town's change didn't come from a sermon or a vow. It came from her own life, from her resilience and Silas's kindness. Ma Perkins had seen it, and she was brave enough to admit her mistake. Sheriff Zeke Jones, the man with the serious demeanor of a lawman, also nodded in agreement. He looked at Silas with respect. "Thaddeus is gone," he said. "He no longer has power here. Everyone saw what you did, Silas. You didn't just protect Clara. You protected this whole town from his greed and malice." Silas just gave a gentle nod, his calloused hand resting softly on Clara's back, a gesture full of emotion. He didn't need to say anything. His actions said it all. He had found a purpose in life, not just to protect the girl he loved, but to protect the town, to protect the values he believed in. They all sat down together, enjoying the meal Ma Perkins had brought. The meal was simple, but full of warmth. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the crops, the horses, and the child Clara and Silas were expecting. Their story was no longer a sad one, but a story of hope, of life and love. It was a story of healing, not just for two people, but for an entire town. When Ma Perkins and Sheriff Zeke Jones left, they left behind not just a basket of food, but a silent promise. They would always be there, always supportive. Clara and Silas stood on the porch, watching them go. The wind still blew, but its sound was no longer a song of loneliness, but a song of peace. Clara's small garden, where the wildflowers were in full bloom, was living proof of that. It was an affirmation that, even in the most wild and harsh places, love can take root and blossom. Clara Bell looked at Silas, her eyes sparkling like two gems in the late afternoon sun. She had found her home, not just in the warm log cabin with its crackling fire and the smell of roasted coffee, but also in the heart of the man standing beside her. And she knew that with him, she would never have to be afraid of anything again. Every breath she took carried a feeling of deep peace, a tranquility she had never dared to dream of. Her life before had been a long series of running, of nights spent huddled in dark corners, of the constant fear that one day she would be abandoned again. Every time someone got close, her heart would pound, a primal reaction of a wounded soul. But now, standing next to Silas, she felt safe, so safe that she could let down all the defenses she had built over the years. She reached up and lightly touched his hand. The hand was calloused and rough, but it gave her a feeling of warmth and strength. It was not the hand of a romantic man, but the hand of a man who had worked hard, who had lived a harsh life, and it was that very hand that had taken hers, that had pulled her out of the quicksand of despair, that had protected her from the storms of life. She felt his love not through flowery words, but through small actions, subtle gestures. He didn't say "I love you," but he had planted a garden for her, bought her flower seeds, and placed his mother's ring in her hand. Those actions had more weight than any words. Silas looked at her, his eyes still quiet, but deep within them was a wordless love, a love that had found life on the barren land of his heart. He gave a slight nod, as if he understood everything she was thinking. He raised his hand and gently stroked her hair, a gesture full of love and affection. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth from his body. She looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to twinkle. She thought about their unborn child, about a bright future waiting for them. She had lost everything, but now she had it all. She had a loving husband, a child, and a home. She was no longer an abandoned orphan girl, but a woman who was loved and cherished. Every breath she took was a profound peace she had never dared to dream of. Her life had been a long series of running, of nights spent huddled in dark corners, of the constant fear that one day she would be abandoned again. But now, standing next to Silas, she felt safe, so safe that she could let down all the defenses she had built over the years. Whenever a ghost of her past crept into her thoughts, a mocking face, a cold word, the feeling of a closed door, she would consciously stop it. No, a voice of courage within her whispered, "You are not that girl anymore." She was Clara Bell, a woman who had survived and grown, a woman with a strong heart and a kind soul. She deserved this happiness. No one had the right to condemn her to a life of hardship. Her life was her own, and with Silas by her side, it was a life of light, hope, and unwavering love. She knew that life would not be easy. There would still be storms, still be difficulties. But with Silas by her side, she was no longer afraid. She had found a place to call home, a place where she could be herself, a place where she could blossom like the wildflowers in her garden. And she knew that they would overcome every difficulty together building a happy and peaceful life. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Clara and Silas walked together through her garden. The garden wasn't big, but it was full of life. Wildflowers were in full bloom, and the tomato plants had begun to bear fruit. Clara recounted the hardships she had gone through, but no longer with bitterness, but with gratitude. "I'm not afraid anymore, Silas," she said. "I've found my peace here." Silas put a small sign on the old fence where their story had begun. The sign was hand-carved with the simple words, "Not for sale." Those words weren't just about the land, but about their love. It represented their choice, to never give up on each other. It was an eternal commitment. When they got back to the cabin, they went into the kitchen together. Clara, with a radiant smile, handed him a homemade cookie. She said, "You are my home, and I am yours." Silas nodded, kissed her forehead, and the two of them looked out at the garden, where Clara's flowers had begun to blossom. Their love didn't need flowery words or grand vows. Their love was silence, understanding, and acceptance. It was a Western love story, a Wild West love, where two wounded people found healing in each other. And it's one of the best Wild West stories people have ever heard. Their love proved that, even in the most wild and harsh places, broken hearts can learn to beat again, and miracles can blossom from the very ashes. Time passed. The barren land of Redemption Creek was now covered in lush green. The silence in Silas Boone's log cabin was no longer empty. It had been filled with the sounds of life. The wind still blew, but it was no longer an enemy. It was an old friend telling fairy tales. The wind whistled through the wildflowers, carrying the scent of wild grass and damp earth, and Clara Bell, now Silas's wife, could feel all of it. Time had shaped and changed them. Clara was no longer a skinny, scared orphan girl. She had a strong vitality, an inner peace. She had become a confident woman, with eyes sparkling with happiness. She caressed her growing pregnant belly, a symbol of hope and life. The scar on Silas's shoulder had also faded, no longer a reminder of guilt, but a mark of a healed past. Together, they built a life on Silas's land. Clara had turned her small garden into a veritable paradise. The wildflowers she had sown were now in full, vibrant bloom, attracting bees and butterflies. The rows of green vegetables and the heavily laden tomato plants provided precious sustenance. The garden wasn't just a source of food, it was a testament to Clara's resilience and vitality. Silas, the man of silence, had learned to open up. He no longer hid his pain. He spent hours watching Clara work in the garden, listening to her talk about her plans for their unborn child. Their conversations didn't require flowery words, just knowing glances and the warmth of a gentle touch.